No hint of what Joseph Kennedy had done was made public in his lifetime. The world Joseph Kennedy had carefully built to shelter his children was blown apart on December the 7th, 1941, when war came to America. Joe and Jack had enlisted in the Navy. Joe became a flyer. "Wouldn't you know," said his father, "naval aviation, the most dangerous thing there is." Jack's poor health forced him to settle for a desk job in Washington, where he began an affair with an older woman, a Danish-born journalist, Inga Arvad. The FBI falsely believed Arvad was a Nazi agent, tapped her telephone, and discovered her romance with Jack. His father insisted he stop seeing Arvad, but he refused. Jack Kennedy was beginning a lifelong pattern of risky behavior, living on the edge. He lobbied hard for active duty, and by April 1943 was in the Pacific, commanding a patrol boat. His vessel, PT-109, was rammed by a Japanese destroyer. 2 crewmen were killed. Kennedy towed a third man to safety, surviving 16 hours in the ocean, further injuring his back. He spent the rest of the war struggling to recover from his injuries and malaria. Kathleen returned to London, joined the Red Cross, and fell in love. She decided to marry. He was the English Lord Hartington, son of the Duke of Devonshire. His family was as staunchly Protestant as the Kennedys were Catholic.
But my father, bless his heart, was a bigoted Protestant. So it must have been an enormous relief to both my mother and my father that Kik was prepared to renounce her faith and become a Protestant.
Rose was shattered that Kik could abandon her Catholic faith. On the wedding day, she sent a single-word telegram: heartbroken. But Joe Jr., stationed in England, gave away the bride, and her father sent a wire: "You are still and always will be tops with me." The bridegroom would soon be killed in action. Joe had survived his tour of duty, but determined to match his younger brother's exploits, he volunteered for a secret mission. "I'm not allowed to say what it is," he wrote to his parents, "but it isn't dangerous, so don't worry." But the mission was very dangerous. Kennedy was to pilot a bomber crammed with explosives towards a German rocket site on the coast of France, aim the plane at the target, and bail out. Just before takeoff, Joe said to a friend, "If I don't come back, tell my dad I love him very much." Kennedy's plane exploded in midair. On a warm Sunday afternoon in Hyannisport, Joseph Kennedy learned that his beloved oldest son was dead. When the war was over, Jack was not sure what he wanted to do. He toyed with journalism, but his father, slowly stirring from his grief, began to awaken his interest in politics.
The conventional view is that after Joe Jr. died, Joe Sr. immediately turned to Jack and said, "Okay, you're now going to be the first Catholic president of the United States." The process was so much more subtle and complicated than that. He saw the depression that his father was suffering. He wanted to reach out and help, but he didn't know how. There was no way he thought he could be what Joe Jr. had been to his father.
Joe Jr. had hoped to run for office in 1946. Now, Jack would take Joe's place and run for his grandfather's old seat in Congress.
This pasty-looking faced kid, he didn't look like any more like a Boston politician that was going to go to Congress than the man on the moon, to be perfectly truthful. And I just smiled and laughed because I didn't think John Kennedy had any chance in the early stages of the campaign.
John Kennedy never saw that district before. I don't think he went into the North End where his mother was born and his grandfather, John F. He had no idea what this district looked like.
I would meet him at 6 o'clock and start off at the Boston Navy Yard, and he would position himself at the main gate, shaking hands until they were all in there, and I'd be passing out Kennedy campaign buttons.
Jack Kennedy was a mesmerizer, actually. When he started to talk to you, I mean, you listened. He was like everybody's son. If, you know, women, they loved him. The girls all thought they were going to might marry him. I don't know. And he hooked on to a lot of people. When I think that he had the Kennedy charm, maybe that's what it was. The ability to be liked instantly. And he always asked, is there anything else? And if it was 9:30 at night, I'd say, there's one more place. And he'd take a deep sigh and say, well, let's go.
The long campaign days left the frail candidate exhausted and in pain. But all the hard work was paying off.
Jack said, Billy, he said, would you be kind enough, he said, to take Mother to the airport? She has to be there at 12 o'clock, New York. So I said, sure, you know. Going down towards the north end, she said to the driver, she said, I was wondering if you had any inkling as to who might be the next congressman from this district.
He said, well, I think I'd like to vote for that young fella from the north end, that young Kennedy fella. He said, he's in the Navy, I was in the Navy. He said, and his grandfather and his mother came from here.
She said to me, that's remarkable, isn't it? They know already. So he's rather hip, he's driving. And he looks back and he said, are you some sort of a relative, miss? She said, my name is Rose Kennedy. I'm Jack's mother. Bang went the brakes. We went bing, bang. He said, boy, am I glad to know you. You know, your son owes me $1.85 since Wednesday.
Rose basked in her son's new celebrity. Honey Fitz returned to the campaign trail, but it was Joe Kennedy who ran the show.
The campaigns were run by Joseph P. Kennedy, and I have strong personal knowledge of it. There never indeed was any campaign manager except Joseph P. Kennedy.
Money was the long arm of politics. Money is the mother's milk of politics. Joe knew that before anybody else came along. You know, you can be a candidate, you can have the issues, you can have the organization, but money does miracles. And money did miracles in that campaign.
Joe understood that whatever Jack's qualities, which he was beginning to respect more and more, were, that he had to be marketed. And I suppose he thought he had to be marketed the way any stock was marketed, the way anything in business was marketed. And he used that to make sure that the people understood he was a war hero, even more of a war hero than he actually was, and that he had these kinds of family qualities that people were going to want to see in their politicians.
There were 6 different mailings by the Kennedy organization. You never dreamed of a mailing, even other than a penny postcard, you never sent a mailing out on the campaign because it was too expensive.
By the time Jack voted in his grandfather's old district, the Kennedys had left nothing to chance.
There were 2 Joseph Russos on the ballot. They must have been afraid that with Joseph Russo on the ballot and the only Italian candidate on the ballot, there was a possibility that every Italian in the district would vote for Joseph Russo. So lo and behold, another Joseph Russo qualified to go on the ballot. Now, there's no doubt in my mind that Joe Kennedy and the people around him put one of those Joseph Russos in the fight, and certainly he had to be paid cash, you know, to allow his name to go on the ballot. So that was how Camelot began, with 2 Joseph Russos on the ballot.
Jack Kennedy, only 29 years old, won an overwhelming victory. But as a congressman, he seemed unserious, easily bored, adrift.
Well, it first impressed me as a fellow who ought to have been in the hospital. He was emaciated, he was weak-looking, and he was weak.
Yeah, he knew what pain was all about. Had it. He wore this brace, and The pain was always with him. It was like a friend. It was never left him, pain.
9 months after he entered Congress, while visiting his sister Kathleen in England, he collapsed.
I called up our doctor, Sir Daniel Davis, and asked him to go round and see Jack. He put him straight into the London clinic, and he said to me, that brother of Lady Hartington's, he hasn't got a year to live. He's very sick. And that, I think, was the first time that they diagnosed Addison's disease.
Addison's disease affects the adrenal glands, causing failure of the circulation, even death. In 1947, there was no known cure. When his condition temporarily stabilized, Jack seemed more determined than ever to enjoy life before time ran out.
He kept taking my girls away from me as fast as I could get them, but they'd always come back after he'd finished with them. And they never felt sorry, even way before he was president. They regarded him as a special event, a big bursting force with this complete honesty.
To be perfect, he wasn't much of a congressman. Matter of fact, he was kind of resented by his colleagues. There would be a very important debate on, and his staff people and his speechwriters would give him a speech. Here were fellows on the committees that had worked for months on the bill. Jack Kennedy would get up and make a speech in Congress, and the press would cover Jack Kennedy's speech, who would know less about the subject than any member of the committee, and they resented.
In April 1948, at the Greenbrier Resort, the Kennedys gathered for a vacation. Kick arrived from England to tell her family that she was in love again. He was a Protestant and married. Rose threatened to break with Kick forever, but Joe agreed to join his daughter in Europe and meet her lover, Lord Fitzwilliam. A month later, Fitzwilliam and Kick left England for a weekend in the south of France.
I went and put them on the plane together, and he had chartered an aircraft. I think it was a Dove, I think it was called in those days, and apparently they got into turbulence over the Alps, and the plane crashed.
In Glacamora.
That morning, Jack Kennedy was at home in Washington, listening to a record he and his sister both loved.
It was Finian's Rainbow, and he had the records, and the International News Service called up, and he was, he kept listening to the music, and he said, ask him if this is, confirmed. And if it's confirmed, will they call back? So they said, well, we have no confirmation right now, but we'll call you back. So he continued to talk about Ella Logan with a great voice. Then when the news came that the fatal accident happened, his eyes filled up with tears. And and they say that the Kennedys never cry. Don't believe that. They do. I saw him. He cried that morning for his sister Kathleen.
In Glacamora, there's fire,
In January 1961, Americans acquired a new first family, unlike anything they had known before. The Kennedys relished their power, and the country delighted in them.
In this town,
there's always the desire to be in and be close, no matter how dull the president. But when the president is not dull, but is glamorous and exciting, and his wife is beautiful, and his kids are gorgeous, and everybody's playing touch football, and they're movie stars, holy smokes.
Both Jack and Jackie had an enormous sense of their own presence. And it's almost as if they both created this image of this handsome couple, attractive, well-clothed, well-mannered, funny, that was partly true, but partly not true at the same time. When Jackie was courting Jack, it probably was exciting to see how much he liked other women. But after a while, she adopted a pattern very similar to Rose's. She knew if she obsessed about it every day, it would destroy herself and destroy the marriage. So she became Jackie Kennedy, something quite apart from Jack Kennedy.
Toujours la première à mon rôle de mère et de femme. Es un honor para mí el estar hoy entre un grupo de los hombres más valientes del mundo.
Well, Mrs. Kennedy, this is the East Room pretty much as Americans have known it now for 60 years.
That's right. This piano was designed by Franklin Roosevelt. And this is the end of the room where Pablo Casals played for us, where we had a portable stage built when we had the Shakespeare players.
Jackie gave it real class. Jackie was the one that redecorated the White House. Jack at a piano could sing the Wearing of the Green as well as any Irish revolutionary you ever came across in your life. But Jackie sort of gave this kind of fragile, delicate Limoges china feeling to the White House.
She got enormous pleasure from the celebrity of being First Lady. But then at certain moments when she wanted her privacy back, she would turn it away. And I think she legitimately wanted to keep her children free from that kind of celebrity. So she would find herself alternately at times wishing the press would write her up and other times saying, "Don't touch me, I want you out of here."
Jackie had gone on a trip, and she had been trying to control how much picture there could be taken of the kids. And the president called me in one day and said, she's gone now. Now's the time to get the kids.
Caroline and John Jr. were the youngest children to live in the White House in the 20th century. And the president, like his father before him, fed the press irresistible photographs of his family. Jack Kennedy embellished his star status with live television press conferences.
He was the first television president. He really was. I can't remember anyone who ever did it better. I mean, he was just instinctively good at it.
Necessary to practice it?
There was a magnetism there to which I was never personally exposed. The existence of which I don't know. But JFK primarily wanted to get off a few good lines.
President, do you think that Mrs. Murphy should have to take into her home a lodger whom she does not want?
The question would be, it seems to me, Miss Gregg, whether Mrs. Murphy had a substantial impact on interstate commerce.
Style came easily to Kennedy. Substance was different. The administration was soon in trouble. After his election, Kennedy had been told of a secret CIA plan to send an army of Cuban exiles to overthrow Fidel Castro and rid the Americas of a communist regime. To Kennedy, it seemed an opportunity to regain the initiative in the Cold War. Instead, it would bring his presidency to the brink of disaster within weeks. Some advisors argued that even a successful invasion would brand the United States an aggressor and risk Soviet retaliation. But the CIA and Joint Chiefs assured Kennedy the invasion would succeed without revealing United States participation. Kennedy gave the go-ahead for a landing at the Bay of Pigs.
They wanted to do it so badly. You know, and as we saw on a much grander scale in Vietnam, if you really want to do something, you can persuade yourself that it can be done.
But everything went wrong. When the landing foundered, Kennedy refused to send in air support, fearful of revealing American involvement. 1,189 men were captured, 114 were killed.
The day afterwards, I remember we were just knocking golf balls into a cornfield aimlessly. And all he'd say is, how could I do it? How could I, Jimmy? How could I?
Critics denounced Kennedy as indecisive. Many now wondered whether he was simply too young, too inexperienced, too impetuous for the job. The Bay of Pigs had been a humiliating failure. In a parliamentary system, I would have to resign, he told CIA chiefs as he shook up the agency, the Pentagon, and the State Department. And most important of all, he resolved to involve his brother Robert in all future big decisions. Now I realize how right Dad was in wanting Bobby in the cabinet, he said. In a crisis, family members are the only ones you can count on. Don't kid anyone about who's the top advisor, Lyndon Johnson told a friend. Bobby is first in and last out. And Bobby is the one he listens to.
His brother's presidency was the most important thing in his professional life. He was willing to be the villain. He was willing to take the attacks. And I honestly believe that he would have taken a bolt of lightning for Jack.
Robert was very much like his father, but there was no guile about him. I mean, bam, that's it. If you monkey with him, he'd bust you in the nose.
Robert Kennedy never shirked conflict. He would risk white hostility in the segregated South by demanding action on voting rights. He declared war on organized crime, and he would head up the operation to overthrow Castro through a new clandestine plan, Operation Mongoose. Ousting Castro is the top priority of the US government, he told the CIA. He ordered intensive sabotage operations against Cuba. The CIA now revealed that since the previous administration, they had an unlikely ally, a gangster Kennedy had once interrogated before the Rackets Committee.
Opposition from anybody that you dispose of them by having them stuffed in a trunk? Is that what you do, Mr. Giancana?
Decline to answer because I honestly believe my answer might tend to
Will
incriminate.
you tell us anything about any of your operations?
Sam Giancana was a notorious hoodlum.
Decline to answer because I honestly believe my answer might tend to incriminate.
I thought only little girls giggled, Mr. Giancana.
The CIA told Robert Kennedy they'd hired him and fellow mobster Johnny Roselli to kill Castro. Giancana was the friend and protector of Judith Campbell, an intimate of President Kennedy's, who claims to have set up meetings between the two men after the Bay of Pigs. President Kennedy made no secret of his view about what should happen to Castro.
Jack never used the word assassination. He used the word elimination of Castro.
Kennedy clearly wanted the Cuban leader eliminated. We were hysterical about Castro at the time, Secretary of Defense McNamara later admitted.
The way these things happen, and which I saw very clearly in a different case in the Eisenhower administration, is that the president very much wants to have a certain individual immobilized and doesn't care too much how that is done.
Precisely how much the president knew of the assassination plots or about the connection between the CIA and the Mafia is impossible to prove more than 30 years after the fact. For his part, Robert Kennedy was angered by the CIA's use of Mafia hoodlums, and he continued to gather evidence against Giancana and Roselli in his war on organized crime. But he did nothing to stop the assassination plots themselves.
Kennedy may well have known that the Mafia was trying to kill Castro at the same time as his brother was trying to prosecute the Mafia. It remains an historical question. It may well be that Kennedy just considered his ability to hold two opposing ideas in his brain to be something that was required of the president.
In May 1961, Kennedy's stubborn resolve to appear vigorous in public betrayed him. A tree planting ceremony in Canada required just one shovelful. Kennedy insisted on 10 and badly strained his injured back. It couldn't have happened at a worse time. He would be dependent on massive injections of painkillers as he faced Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev at Vienna. Kennedy had arranged a summit meeting he hoped would change the course of the Cold War.
Kennedy thought that when he and Khrushchev sat down in a room and closed the doors, that they could work out some sort of political deal that would keep the Soviet Union and the United States from being in confrontation during the Kennedy years.
But Khrushchev was in no mood to bargain. The Bay of Pigs had convinced him that Kennedy, who was younger than Khrushchev's son, could be intimidated. Kennedy returned home still stunned by his encounter with Khrushchev. He called up the reserves and warned the country to prepare for nuclear attack. But instead of seizing West Berlin, Khrushchev built the Berlin Wall to stop the flow of refugees. The crisis eased. A wall, Kennedy said, is a hell of a lot better than a war. Still, Kennedy feared he had failed to convince Khrushchev of American resolve. "We have a problem in making our power credible," he told a newspaperman, "and the place to do it is Vietnam." In a move that would be among the most fateful of his presidency, he tripled the number of military advisors sent to aid South Vietnam. In the autumn of 1961, American troops were on the alert in Berlin. American advisors were on their way to Vietnam, and Operation Mongoose continued against Cuba. It had been a very mean year, Robert Kennedy reflected. The Kennedys had learned that there were no shortcuts to statecraft. Joseph Kennedy seemed to have fulfilled all his ambitions. Surrounded by 17 grandchildren on his 73rd birthday, he had one son in the White House, another in the cabinet, but still wanted more. This time for Ted. Edward Moore Kennedy was just 29 years old, 15 years younger than Jack. He had attended Harvard, scored a touchdown in the Yale game, married Joan Bennett, and managed his brother's campaign in the West. But he had held just one real job, as one of the 26 assistant district attorneys in Suffolk County, Massachusetts. Nonetheless, his father was determined to make him a United States senator. "You boys have what you want," he told his older sons. "Now it's his turn."
Then there was Teddy, who was going to the Senate. You know, there are people who would kill to get into the United States Senate. That's a very big job. And here is this not very bright, not very strong, not very imposing or impressive kid who was going into the Senate only because his name was Kennedy.
President Kennedy had a saying that if you, as a politician, if you see blue sky, go for it. And in Teddy's case, the blue sky was a seat that had been vacated by Jack when he'd taken over the presidency. And so Ted had a real opportunity that he might not get again.
Jack Kennedy had arranged for an old friend to hold his vacant Senate seat until Ted was old enough to run. On the 18th of December, 1961, the president flew from a conference in Bermuda to see his father. Joseph Kennedy was about to see all his 3 surviving sons hold high office. But while the president was still airborne after his visit, the ambassador suffered a massive stroke. He lay near death his right side paralyzed. The family gathered.
In the beginning, they really thought this father would get well. But Kennedy had to. But Kennedy does. So when they saw him advancing and getting better, naturally that was great. And they would applaud all the time. No matter if he took a little step, they would applaud. And it wasn't until later that they realized that very little was going to be done.
Joseph Kennedy's active life was over. The restless, driven, self-made millionaire, the father whose blazing ambition had fueled his son's climb, the power broker who had always seemed able to get anything he wanted, had lost the ability to shape events. He would live on for 8 more years, a mute and helpless witness to all that lay ahead. Ted Kennedy turned 30 in February 1962, now old enough to run for his brother's old Senate seat. But when Edward McCormick, nephew of the Speaker of the House, challenged Kennedy's right to the nomination, the president sent Ted to ask Tip O'Neill to intercede.
He said, gee, he said, I don't want to run against Eddie. He says, you know, he says, it's not good for the party, it's not good for the relationships in Washington. And he said, I'll pay, we understand Eddie owes $100,000. We'll take care of his expenses. My father will see that he gets a good client. He said, anything that he's interested in, he said, he can have. He said, an ambassadorship or something of that nature. And I listened to the story, and I went back and told John McCormick, and John talked to Eddie, and I talked to Eddie, and Eddie made the decision that he was going to run anyway.
The Kennedys failed to buy off McCormick. And when Ted was challenged to a televised debate, the president feared his inexperienced younger brother might give in to his emotions if attacked.
I remember sitting in the Oval Office being peppered by questions by my brother and by a couple of his aides, which was quite intimidating, certainly, to say the least. But I was being asked by the master.
The president had Ted rehearse his responses and warned him to stay calm, no matter what McCormick said.
I asked if his name was Edward Moore, with his qualifications, with your qualifications, Ted, if it was Edward Moore, your candidacy would be a joke. But nobody's laughing. Nobody's laughing. Nobody's laughing because his name is not Edward Moore. It's Edward Moore Kennedy. And I say it makes no difference what your name is.
McCormick's attack backfired. Ted Kennedy won the sympathy of the audience and the primary. He would go on to face Republican George Lodge, son of Henry Cabot Lodge, the Boston Brahmin John Kennedy had defeated a decade earlier. On John Kennedy's 45th birthday, his wife spent the day riding in Virginia. She had no appetite for the special treat to be served up at his birthday party in Madison Square Garden. Marilyn Monroe had been a trophy for the Kennedys, and she had become fixated on them.
36 after having had Happy Birthday sung to me in such a sweet, wholesome way.
Afterwards, Arthur Krim, who was a film producer, gave a small party in his apartment. Talking to Marilyn Monroe was like talking to someone underwater. I mean, she was whether elated or sedated or what, I don't know.
People have always made such a great to-do over Marilyn's associations with the Kennedys. I have never believed they're very deep, actually. Maybe there were plenty of associations. There were some I could have put my finger on. But in that family, there had been no traditions of monogamy.
There was plenty of talk about Kennedy's womanizing, and the talk was just universal. In those days, however, there was a sort of an understanding in the press that a responsible, conscientious journalist would not write about anybody's private life.
Everyone in the press really loved him, and he worked them like an entertainer works a room. And he really did. He used them every single minute, so that they were very hesitant to dwell into his private life or to write about it. Jack felt that he could do as he pleased, and he did as he pleased. But he was a tremendous risk taker.
But in February 1962, Kennedy's risky behavior caught up with him. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover told the president and his brother that the FBI knew about the relationship with Judith Campbell and that she was a friend of Giancana and Roselli. A month later, he saw the president alone and warned him of the risk of blackmail.
Jack called me after the meeting. First, he asked me to come back to Washington, and I said no, that I couldn't. And then he said, go to my mother's and call him. And that's when he told me, he said, my phone probably wasn't safe.
Despite Hoover's warnings, Kennedy kept in telephone contact with Campbell for several months. But he cut his links with his Hollywood friend, Frank Sinatra, who had ties to the mob, and who had introduced him to Judith Campbell.
It's very difficult for historians to tell the truth about somebody they all revered and admired. To have a president who cannot control his sexual appetite, who is always taking these reckless risks and cannot stop himself, is not only to threaten the status of the presidency, it also threatens national security. And the truth is, everybody knew it, and nobody could stop him.
Coffee with Kennedy's at Hyannisport.
By October 1962, Ted Kennedy's campaign for the Senate was in full swing.
Here is Ted, our youngest son, in front of his father. You can see Jack, the president now. You can see Bobby, the attorney general, and my daughters. On either side, of course, are the papal guards. I thought with all these spiritual advantages, Ted might grow up and be a priest, or even a bishop. But he met a beautiful blonde one night, and so that was the end of my ambition in that direction. Hello, Tara. How are you, dear? Have you got your book to read to Grandma this morning?
But as Rose Kennedy campaigned for her youngest son, her second was facing the most serious crisis of his presidency, the most dangerous crisis of the entire Cold War era. The details of that crisis and Kennedy's handling of it would be examined and re-examined for decades. And its impact upon him would profoundly change the way he and his successors waged the Cold War in the coming years. On October the 16th, Kennedy was shown photographs taken by a U-2 spy plane. The Soviets were secretly building bases in Cuba for nuclear missiles capable of striking New York, Chicago, Washington. The Bay of Pigs and Kennedy's continuing secret campaign to overthrow Castro had convinced Soviet Premier Khrushchev another American invasion of Cuba was imminent.
So
Khrushchev came to the conclusion that the only way to save Cuba was to install there several Soviet missiles which would deter a potential American invasion.
But to Kennedy, Soviet missiles so close to the United States were intolerable. They would have to be removed. The question was how to do it without provoking nuclear war. Kennedy secretly assembled a group of seasoned counselors from inside and outside his administration. His experience with the Bay of Pigs had taught him not to rely only on the military and CIA, to seek a wider range of opinions. But most advisors initially favored a military response, including Treasury Secretary Douglas Dillon.
Those of us who had had previous experience with the Soviet Union were all in favor of a quick attack at first. Robert Kennedy took a different approach. He said that this would be a terrible thing in the world because this would be an unprovoked assault and a lot of other people would get killed that were not necessarily the Soviets that were putting up the bases.
Bobby was very eloquent. He said, I do not want my brother to be the Tojo of American history. I do not want us, the United States, to pull a Pearl Harbor. He wanted us to be tough and all that, but not to strike without warning or so on and so forth.
For 6 days, as Kennedy's advisors argued in secret over what should be done about the missiles, the president did his best to act as if nothing unusual was happening.
Recognizes the problems of this state and country and wants to do something about it.
Even the president's press secretary was unaware of the missile crisis when Kennedy instructed him to tell the press he had a cold and would return to Washington.
And we headed out of the hotel, went to the airport, got on the plane. And about halfway through the flight, I found myself alone in the president's cabin with him. I said, Mr. President, you don't have a cold. There's something else going on. He said, you bet there's something else going on. And he said, when you find out, grab your balls.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba.
Kennedy revealed the crisis to the world on October the 22nd and declared a naval blockade of Cuba to remain in force until the missiles were removed. The Kennedys had resisted pressure from the military to bomb the missile sites. They would give the Soviet premier the opportunity to withdraw peacefully. But no one knew what Khrushchev would do. The nation braced for the possibility of nuclear war.
I remember there being a discussion at home with my father about whether or not we should be moved. There was a bunker under Camp David where there was room for us. But there were two considerations that I remember my father articulating at that time. One was that we shouldn't be moved because it would cause other people to panic if we were moved out of Washington. And the other one was that if there were a nuclear war, none of us would want to be around afterwards anyway.
In the end, both sides pulled back from confrontation. Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for Kennedy's public pledge not to invade Cuba and his private promise to remove American missiles from Turkish bases near the Soviet border. The gravest crisis of the Cold War was over. Kennedy had shown a blend of toughness and diplomatic skill scarcely imaginable when he first took office. But he also recognized how close the world had come to disaster, how large a part luck had played in its survival.
You know, it's absolutely crazy. He says the two men sitting on opposite sides of the world have the power to destroy all of Western civilization. And it was really at that point, I think that was the turning point of Kennedy's presidency.
Kennedy moved to reduce the possibility of future confrontation. In the ensuing months, he negotiated the first arms agreement of the nuclear age, installed the first hotline to the Soviet premier, and at American University in June 1963, called for a new era of tolerance.
Let us re-examine our attitude towards the Soviet Union. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures. And we are all mortal.
When John Kennedy came to Berlin in the summer of 1963, he was more popular in Europe than in his own country. The outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis had relieved doubts about the young president. He was nudging his allies towards a united Europe, and his speech to the embattled Berliners was infused with a rare eloquence.
All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
But for some at home, Kennedy's talk of freedom abroad rang hollow. His reluctance to push for stronger civil rights laws had angered many blacks and liberals who had supported him in 1960.
We were putting a hard pressure on the administration. The greatest power of that was its moral force. And the Kennedys were feeling terribly agitated. They felt that we did not quite understand their problem. We didn't have a clear view of the world. We didn't have a clear view of the subtleties of these things and what they meant. We were just not playing the game.
John Kennedy had been elected partly because of his promise to secure equal rights for black Americans. Yet once in office, he had hoped to avoid too great an involvement in the politically divisive struggle. But events overtook the Kennedys. In 1961, they were forced to send federal marshals into Alabama to protect the Freedom Riders. In 1962, they were forced to send in the National Guard to restore order at the University of Mississippi. Still, Kennedy resisted sending strong civil rights legislation to Congress, unwilling to risk further alienating the powerful Southern conservatives blocking his domestic program.
I was not sympathetic with the Kennedys' political problems. I was sympathetic with the problems that black people were having. And it seemed to me the Kennedys wanted both ways. They wanted to appear to be our friends, and they wanted to be the brake on our movement.
Kennedy watched along with the country in May 1963 as racial violence erupted in Birmingham, Alabama. Horrified by what he had seen, he polled his political advisors about sending a broad new civil rights bill to Congress.
Most of his advisors in the White House, maybe all of them, told him that's a terrible political mistake. Many thought that the bill could not be passed. And they were thinking, well, the president's going to put his presidency on line for this bill, and he's going to fail.
Robert Kennedy disagreed. As Attorney General, he had focused on the inequities of American society, and he would champion civil rights for the rest of his life.
Robert Kennedy was a man of passion. He responded very viscerally to situations like the question of civil rights, our treatment of black America. John Kennedy regarded that as irrational. Robert Kennedy regarded it as intolerable.
In June, Robert Kennedy and other advisors met with the president in the Oval Office and urged him to support the bill in a television address to the nation. Their debate was recorded for a documentary film.
I don't think you can get by now without having an address on television, at least during this period of time, giving some direction and having it in the hands of the president.
In the end, Kennedy sided with his brother. That evening, for the first time in history, a president would declare civil rights for black Americans a moral issue.
All of a sudden, he brought passion to it. He brought that eloquence to it. And it electrified me and all kinds of other black people.
And that night in June when he spoke, I think, to the heart and to the soul of America. I would never forget that speech.
We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities.
The bill was the most sweeping civil rights legislation since the attempt to reconstruct the South after the Civil War.
If you look back at who John Kennedy was when he came to the United States Senate, and you see who he was on racial issues when he died, you have to say that's what you want. You know that most white Americans are racist. You can't help but be racist in this culture unless you have superb parents. What you hope is that white Americans can be educated and that they can be purged to some real degree of their racism and that they can be brought to do decent things. That's what happened to this man.
Labor Day 1963. The Kennedys gather at Hyannisport. The President and Jacqueline were still recovering from the death of their third child, Patrick, born prematurely that August. John Jr. greeted his grandfather. The ambassador had been confined to a wheelchair for nearly 2 years now. Later that day, Kennedy prepared to be interviewed by Walter Cronkite about the growing American commitment in Vietnam, where Kennedy had now sent some 16,000 military advisors. For decades to come, his words that afternoon would be used by some to prove he had already decided to pull out of the war.
In the final analysis, it's their war. They're the ones who have to win it or lose it. We can help them, we can give them equipment, we can send our men out there as advisors, but they have to win it, the people of Vietnam, against the communists.
But what the president said next would be used by others to prove the opposite, that Kennedy planned to continue America's commitment.
But I don't agree with those who say we should withdraw. That'd be a great mistake. That'd be a great mistake. I know people don't like Americans to be engaged in this kind of an effort. 47 Americans have been killed in combat with the enemy. But this is a very important struggle, even though it's far away.
Kennedy's ambiguous answer reflected deep divisions in his administration. The war was going badly. 2 months later, he secretly encouraged a military coup in which the Vietnamese president was murdered, hoping to install more effective leadership. The new regime proved just as flawed. The war in Vietnam would grow and become the most controversial legacy of the Kennedy presidency.
This dinner marks the beginning of a great effort which we are going to make in New England in 1964. New England is the birthplace of this administration, and we are proud of it.
I first of all want to express my appreciation to my brother Teddy for his offering me his coattails. My last campaign, I suppose, may be coming up very shortly. But Teddy's around, and therefore, these dinners can go on indefinitely.
I think he felt that it was very important to get a second term. I remember we took a walk up in Arlington Cemetery, and we were talking. He said, we started discussing where we'd like to be buried. And it was an odd discussion, but he said, well, I suppose I ought to be buried up in Boston because that's where my library is going to be. And then his face darkened, and he said, of course, I won't have a library if I don't get a second term because nobody's going to give a damn.
Before going campaigning that November, Kennedy flew again to Hyannisport for a Sunday with his father.
And now we're leaving Monday, and the helicopter would take off from the field there where we played touch football, and the ambassador would be wheeled out to the porch so that we'd be able to watch him all the way. president put his hand on his father's shoulder, you know, and kissed him on the head. And as we take off, he's looking down. He has the picture window on the helicopter, and he said, "Look at him, Dave." And he made it all possible.
I came back to Washington with the president. He was laying down. They had a bed in the Air Force One for him to lie on. So I said, "Gee, I really hate to go to Texas. I got to go to Texas next week, and it's just a pain in the rear end, and I just don't want to go. I wish I could get out of it."
Kennedy in the fall of 1963 was looking forward to the campaign of 1964. He was beginning to travel in parts of the country where he knew he needed to shore up his popularity, which was sagging because of the civil rights legislation. He was implored to come to Texas, where two factions of the Democratic Party were at each other's throats.
I said, "Well, you know how Lyndon is. Lyndon was vice president. Lyndon wants to ride with me, but John Connally is the governor, and he wants to ride, and I think the protocol says he's supposed to ride, and then Johnson wants Jackie to ride with him." And Connally was at that time a little bit jealous of Lyndon, and Lyndon was a little jealous of him, so it's all these fights were going on. He said, "I just don't want to get out of that mess. I hate to go. I wish I could think of a way to get out of it."
After lunch on Friday, November the 22nd, 1963, Joseph Kennedy was resting quietly in his bedroom.
I heard the screaming, and I knew it was Dora, the downstairs maid, screaming. And she was yelling, "Mrs. Dallas, Mrs. Dallas." So I ran out down the long hall past Mrs. Kennedy's room, and I said, "Dora, be quiet. What is it?" And she started screaming, "The president was shot. The president was shot." So then Mrs. Kennedy came out, and she said, "Will you please stop all this noise?" she said. And she said, "Mrs. Dallas, you should know better," she said, with my husband down the hall. And she said, "Stop this noise." And so I said, "There's been an accident with the president." And I didn't want to be the one to tell her. And I said, "It's on television." So she just looked at me, and she went into her room.
Ted Kennedy was presiding over the Senate when word reached him that his brother had been shot. Robert Kennedy was at home when the telephone rang. It was J. Edgar Hoover. The president had been shot, he said. He would call back when he had more details.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago. Vice President Lyndon Johnson has left the hospital.
Finally, everything settled in the Lincoln Room, I think. It was the big, when you turn left when you come in the door. And it came time to go to bed, and I was with Bobby then most of the time, and I went upstairs, and I went to get some sleeping pills for him. And I gave them to him and talked with him for a while, and then he seemed to be ready to go. And so I closed the door, and I waited outside just to see, and I heard him just sobbing. Talking directly, and he was saying, "Why? You know, why, God? Why? We're doing so well. Everything was really so poised so well. Why?" And he repeated it and repeated it and repeated it, and finally quiet, and I left.
And that evening, Eunice and Teddy came. And Eunice fell down the side of the bed, which she never did. She put her head down on her father's knees, and she said, "Dad, Jack has been shot." She said, "Jack's in heaven. Jack's in heaven, so he's all right." In the morning, when I brought the paper in, and I wasn't going to give it to him, I couldn't, so I put it on the dresser, so he pointed to it. And I said, there's bad news in it. I said, do you remember? And he just looked at me, and I said, it's about the president. I didn't say your son. I said, it's about the president. And he just went like this to the paper. And he took the paper, and he looked at the headlines, and he put his head back on the pillow. And there was just horrible, I mean, the silence there. And then I looked at him, and this man that rarely cried, I saw the tears coming down his cheeks.
It was just over 1,000 days since John Kennedy had been inaugurated.